Hello, I'm Loxton, and welcome to my universe. About a week ago, my good friend, or rather permanent companion Maxwell, decided to make a video about 15 things Nintendo didn't actually invent. It went over things that people commonly assume or even claim that Nintendo invented when really they just innovated, meaning made a lot better and popularized.
People need to learn the difference between the two. People were legitimately calling me a liar when they could easily spend 20 seconds and research. Do you really think people just go on the internet and lie?
Ugh. Anyway, since a lot of people don't like it when you say anything negative about Nintendo, I decided to step in and show you 16 things that Nintendo actually did invent, going a step further than that other video. And a few of them may even surprise you. By that I mean I'm going to be saving the most interesting ones for last. Number 1, in-cartridge battery backup to save your games.
Oh, so right off the bat you're going after one of the things that I said Nintendo didn't invent.
Not quite, and if you get over yourself for a moment you'll find out. While true, the technology and idea of saving your game instead of using those dreaded passwords wasn't invented by Nintendo like it's often credited as being. More information on his video. Nintendo did, however, invent the particular method of doing so that they used, and that particular method then became the popular way of doing it, from the NES days all the way up until the Sony PlayStation. It was called battery backup. It basically means that the game cartridge would have a small watch battery inside of it. Because of the way memory storage works on cartridges, it can only remember temporary data like your save files as long as it has electricity flowing through it. Meaning, for the vast majority of games up until The Legend of Zelda, every time you turned off your game, you would lose your data. The Intellivision got around this with an obscure attachment that would store your game saves onto a cassette tape, similar to the idea behind the PlayStation and Nintendo 64's memory cards, though only as similar as the idea of saving your game onto an external thing that doesn't need a battery. But external things can be lost, and at the time, memory card technology was too expensive, and adding a cassette reader and writer to the Famicom and NES would have just been too costly and complicated. So, Nintendo invented a workaround by including battery backup, a little watch battery inside the cart that keeps the save data there.
Well, until the battery dies decades later.
Number 2, the Gamepad. There were a large number of consoles that came out before the Famicom and NES, but they all shared one thing in common that I think Maxwell did a good job of explaining.
Yeah, hang on, I'm fine. Nope. Okay, yeah.
How do you throw up if you don't have a stomach?
Because I'm a cartoon character and I can do what I want.
Gotcha. These controllers were all pretty miserable. Limited buttons, awful joysticks, and more commonly you held them like a TV remote in your hand, and there's just no good way of explaining how miserable they were to use compared to modern controllers. So Nintendo, when introducing the NES and Famicom, invented a whole new type of controller, now dubbed the Gamepad layout. A controller with a horizontal layout instead of a vertical one. You control everything with your thumbs now, and pretty much they realized that their target audience were human.
But don't get too happy. I stand by my claim that Nintendo didn't invent the digital pad.
A directional pad. While both are technically correct, you should have gone with the modern name as to not confuse people. Number 3, animated cutscenes, though there are some contentions around this one. It all depends on what you consider to be a cutscene, but first let's cover some history. Before the games I'm going to mention, there were no cutscenes in games, at least not animated ones. You would have to learn the story from the manual, or some games would have pictures and text appear to deliver the story, but they weren't animated. That was the case until Pac-Man or Donkey Kong. Technically speaking, Pac-Man came first, but there is debate as to whether or not its animated sequences count as cutscenes or not. Here's what they look like. They play in between certain levels of the game, however, they don't really add anything to the game. At all. They don't explain any story or much of anything, really. There is just nothing dynamic about them, it's just the sprites from the game moving around, the only exception being this bigger Pac-Man sprite. So is this an animated cutscene or just an animated sequence? Meanwhile, in Donkey Kong, you get a cutscene that explains the story at the beginning of the game. Donkey Kong steals Pauline and climbs up a tower, damaging it in the process. This explains why the game layout is the way it is, and the motivation for Jumpman. This is inarguably a cutscene. It lays out what you need to know, and then there are even more of these scenes in between every level, where this heart appears between Jumpman and Pauline before DK gets angry and grabs her and climbs up some more, explaining why you have to climb more and more of the tower. So this one is up for debate, but what did you think? Did Nintendo invent the animated cut scene while Pac-Man just has an animated sequence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. In the meantime, let's move on to number 4. Dual screens. The Nintendo DS lineup was highly successful, and it wasn't just thanks to it being an amazing handheld with a touchscreen, especially when compared to that system that invented the concept. But the DS also had dual screens, which allowed for some varied and incredibly unique types of gameplay not possible before. Right away, The World Ends With You comes to mind. If you have either a DS or a 3DS and like action RPGs, I highly recommend that one. It's one of my favorites, and the way it plays would not be possible without dual screens. The mobile version is butchered. Anyway, but it wasn't the DS that invented the dual screen concept, it was actually the Game & Watch systems all way back when. These ones here have 2 screens so that you can manage multiple things at once. Nintendo also brought dual screens to the arcade systems with the original Punch-Out, and even the Wii U could be considered a dual screen system, one in the controller and the one you plug the thing into. And thanks to that, the Wii U also has some amazingly creative game concepts on there that aren't possible without 2 screens. Number 5, the first fake friend, or a robot that would just play games with you. Rob has an interesting history. The video game crash of '83 was incredibly harsh, and people just completely lost trust in game systems. So Nintendo invented Rob to be sold with the NES. This would allow the NES to be sold in the toy section instead of the electronics section.
And apparently that worked because parents are stupid.
Rob would look at your television, and depending on where he saw your character on screen, he would move gyros and place them on the Player 2 controller. He was playing a game with you. It was great, and he was the first of his kind.
Shame Nintendo can't invent actual friends for their fans, though.
Number 6, the video game microphone. It's a gimmick, sure, telling your Nintendogs who's a good boy, and angrily yelling at Pikachu.
Pikachu, put that down! Pikachu, just do it! Dang it, Pikachu!
But it's a gimmick that Nintendo came up with all the way back on the Famicom. Only a few games used it, and most future consoles wouldn't even have it, but it was a very interesting idea. Number 7, handles on a console.
Oh geez, did we reach the middle of the list? You start with interesting ones to get people hooked, and then you save the best for last to end with a bang, so the middles of lists are always bland.
You aren't supposed to give people YouTuber secrets.
Why? Anyone with half a brain already knows that thanks to the septillions of top 10 videos on this godforsaken website.
Gah. So Nintendo was the first to put a handle on a home game console. Why? Who knows? Maybe to make it easier for kids to move it around, take it to their friend's house or something? Or maybe it's to make it a non-form hugging shape. You can't scoot it into the back of a cabinet and forget about it, so that means you see it more often, so you buy more things for it.
That theory was so dumb, I actually liked it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I feel so much better about myself knowing I didn't come up with it.
Number 8, the Game Link cable. This cable allowed 2 Game Boys to connect, and while most people immediately think of Pokemon as the big game that caused this to release, it was actually designed for battle mode on Tetris, which came out on the Game Boy in 1989, while Pokemon didn't come out until 1996. First, handheld gaming was revolutionary, and now, handheld gaming had multiplayer too. Number 9, the video game movie.
Wait, I know this one. It's that garbage Mario Bros. Movie. Sure, it was the first movie based on a video game, but Nintendo had almost nothing to do with it besides giving the movie studio permission.
I suppose, though when you're talking about something as abstract like inventing a genre or style of art, everyone involved usually gets credit.
I suppose.
Number 10, and a little bonus one in there, dual controllers and the first-party left-handed controller. Maxwell was really keen to point out that the Wii did not invent motion controls in gaming, but what it did do was give us a first-party controller that was split in the middle with a cord, allowing gamers to take up a large number of poses while gaming previously not possible. Want to spread your arms far apart but still want to play the game? Now you can, all thanks to Nintendo. Also, inadvertently, this meant that Nintendo invented the first-party left-handed controller. Just switch which hand you have the nunchuck in and boom, left-handed. Though this depends on how you define left-handed. Back in the olden days of gaming, you controlled the direction stick with your right hand and buttons in the left, meaning back then this layout was considered right-handed. Over time this swapped, but they were still considered right-handed controllers. Since then, first parties haven't really given lefties the best options. That is, until the Wii, though I guess if you don't want to count that, then you could still say the Wii is the first-party ambidextrous controller. You can just switch it back and forth whenever. Number 11, rumbling controllers. Don't you say anything, Maxwell. So Nintendo didn't invent rumble technology, nor were they the first to bring it to gaming, but they brought it onto a controller first, which, as you can imagine, created a massive new amount of immersion in games.
Can we please leave the mediocre section of this list now?
I was just getting to that, jeez. Number 12, the 8-bit console, meaning the Famicom and NES. Now, that may not seem like a major thing, since PCs have always had more advanced tech than consoles, and typically consoles are just specialized old PC technology. But hear me out with this one. First of all, the game crash had just happened. And while there were a number of specific games to blame for that, another factor was that game consoles weren't really advancing all that much. There was only so much you could do with the technology in the Atari and Intellivision systems. And Nintendo knew this, so for their first venture into console gaming, they had to do something drastic. Something that even many gaming PCs at the time couldn't do. An 8-bit system with 8-bit graphics. They combined so many fresh and revolutionary technologies and even invented their own specific and patented types of sound cards and graphics processors. They are all old and outdated and the patents aren't even being touched anymore, but for the time, this was big, and not only did it kickstart the gaming market all over again, it also started the bit wars, and grabbed the attention of everyone. Nintendo saved gaming and popularized it beyond anyone's dreams. And doing that wasn't just thanks to their console, but also thanks to our number 13 on this list, quality control. The biggest thing that led to the game crash was a lack of quality control on the Atari and Intellivision systems. On those systems, pretty much anyone could release anything on the system, which, of course, flooded the market with absolute trash games. So people lost trust in games, and so when Nintendo stepped into the whole market, they brought with them a new concept to the gaming world: a quality control system and a game approval process. If you wanted your game on the NES, and wanted that Nintendo seal of approval, you would have to send your game to the Nintendo Approval Committee to be judged. Sure, plenty of games fell through the cracks and were still pretty bad, but not nearly as many or nearly as bad as a lot of the Atari ones. But with this approval process came another concept that was fresh to the gaming world. And that is our number 14, video game censorship. The NES era of games are infamous for their sheer amount of censorship done to the American versions of games. Violence was toned down immensely, sexuality was completely removed, and any and all religious references had to be taken out of games. If your game had any of these, they would not be approved. I have a big video all about this right here, check it out later. Now on to number 15, POS, Electronic Product Registration. You may not know what that is, so allow me to tell you why Nintendo invented it. In the 90s, Nintendo realized that their profitability was being hurt by fraudulent returns to various retailers around the globe, meaning people were stealing systems either from retailers or from other people, and then trying to return them to stores to make money. It was most commonly done to electronics because they were so expensive for their size. It is a crime, sure, Nintendo are kind of crime fighters in that regard then, but to Nintendo specifically, this provided them with false information about the sales and return rates. It was so bad that they would sometimes see an overall loss of profit from retailers. And low profitability is bad for business, so they wanted to stop this from happening. So, they came up with the POS Electronic Product Registration System, a system that tracks each individual product by creating a number based off the UPC and its serial number. This number was recorded in a centralized network under Nintendo's control. Anywhere a particular electronic went, they knew about it. That meant that any product returned would be accounted for if it had been sold. So, if you bought an NES at Target and tried to return it to a Target across town, or if you stole it, or if you walked to the electronics department, then walked to the return counter, the system would alert the clerk and tell them even the exact point of sale that it was purchased at, or if it hadn't even been purchased yet. It even went as far as providing a list of accessories that the product was sold with, like how many controllers it had, making the clerk not need as much training. This, in the end, prevented about 72% of all fraudulent returns on Nintendo products. And Nintendo, being the nice company that it is, would actually benefit the entire marketplace with this technology. But it knew that its competitors wouldn't really like Nintendo having access to all of its sales records and locations. So what does Nintendo do? They make an entirely new company dedicated to this service, SIRAS.com. That way, they could benefit the whole world without being able to see everyone else's sales numbers. And if you thought that one was super interesting, well, I have one more for you. Number 16, Nintendo invented the PlayStation. Seriously, if you didn't already know that, you're probably very intrigued as to how this could possibly be. Well, here's the story. So back when disc-based consoles were a brand new thing, what with the Sega CD and all, Nintendo wanted to hop onto this new technology also. But they knew nothing about disc technology. But you know who does? Sony, one of the inventors of it. At the time, Sony had no interest in a video game system. They were content with their TVs and VCRs and radios and now their CD players, but Nintendo came to them with an idea. Let's work together and make the PlayStation, they said. It would be Nintendo's next system and Sony's first at the same time. And so they did. And prototypes were made. I've even gotten to see one up close at a Games Expo in Sacramento. So did Arlo. But here is where the drama begins. Nintendo was never super comfortable working with Sony. The contract deal would have let Sony get some of the rights to Mario and Zelda, which Nintendo were not so sure about. So even after doing all of that teamwork and inventing the PlayStation together, Nintendo backed out of the deal and made a more favorable contract with Philips, and together they made the Philips CDI. Needless to say, Nintendo made a mistake. Not only did they help create an abomination, they also created their biggest competitor that would eventually overtake them in sales. Because Sony just didn't want to waste this great creation, so they decided to further advance it themselves and make it their own. The Sony PlayStation.
Oh, it's poetry.
So now you know 16 things that Nintendo actually did invent. Some of them were kinda well known or obvious, while others were... oh, they actually did that. So which one was your favorite? Mine is 15 because it's strange that Nintendo made that. You wouldn't even expect a video game company to make some weird business thing that changes the entire marketplace. And if you would like to see a somewhat controversial video about 15 things Nintendo didn't actually invent, that's Maxwell's video right here. And until next time, please remember to never stop using that noggin.
And some of you need to remember to use it in the first place.